Today we're going to talk about the blood covenant. It's the basic elements of what Christianity and more importantly, Judaism is all about. Today we're going to really try to emphasize as much as we can with the time we have about Judaism and the basic core elements of what Judaism is all about. We watched the video already. There's some of the things in the video that just are not really clear, and I actually take some exception to some of the statements that are made, and you may come across that as we go into this discussion. When we use the word covenant, when we talk about covenant, what does that conjure in your mind? What do you think that means?
Vampires.
Say again?
That's the first thing.
Vampires. Interesting. Why vampires?
Oh wait, no, that's covenant.
Coven. Oh, witches and coven. Yes.
Like a pact?
Yeah.
He says a pact. It's a good word. Yes. The Ark of the Covenant. Yes. We're going to look at why it's called the Ark of the Covenant in a few minutes. But the word itself, covenant, what does that suggest to you?
Sacred.
Sacred? Actually, and I get this a lot, a covenant is not something necessarily that is sacred, because there are different kinds of covenants. For example, if you read a will, the word covenant is prominent in a person's last will and testament, where the word, in fact, the term testament and covenant are actually sometimes interchangeable. And so, in some ways, we're going to find out that it's become a sacred term to some people, but it didn't start that way. Okay? I like the word that you used, what you just said, pact. It really is a formal agreement, is all it is. It's another way of saying a contract. In some places, when you have countries, they may use the term treaty, where they make a formal agreement between countries. There are different ways to utilize the term. But in point of fact, the only thing that a covenant is basically a very strong or binding agreement between two or more parties. Okay? Now, what do you think, having established that a covenant is a very strong agreement, what do you think a blood covenant is? Yes.
Like a sacred?
Sacred? It might be sacred. It may not be sacred. There's some things that have some blood oaths and blood covenants that are not sacred, but they're just as binding. Yes, ma'am.
Is it like something within the family?
It could be within a family. Yeah, like blood. Yeah, but you don't have to be in the same family. In fact, if you're not in the same family, a blood covenant becomes even more important. Yes. You make a black pact with your blood. You sign with your blood, or there's some blood involved. Is that what you're saying? Say again? Like in Harry Potter?
Yeah.
Tell me about that. I don't know. I didn't watch Harry Potter.
What?
No.
It was Narcissa Malfoy and Severus Snape made a unbreakable vow.
Unbreakable vow. That's a good way to say. Did you hear that? She said it's some kind of unbreakable vow. We're going to.
That's what it was called.
Yes, yes. Yes, that's good. Yes. It involves death, absolutely. You're going to see that in a minute. Huh? Well, we're going to talk about that in a minute. We're going to get to that when we get to the new covenant. All right? But all of these, anybody ever heard of the gang called the Bloods? Why are you laughing? The Bloods. Anybody know why they call themselves Bloods?
Because they made blood covenant.
They actually do make a blood oath. Their slogan is blood in, blood out. In order for you to become a blood, some blood has to be shed some kind of way. And the only way, no, it's not only just with your knucks, it's maybe something else. And there's only one way out, and it's blood out. La Cosa Nostra, or the mafia, makes blood oaths. And once you enter into that oath, there's only one way out of that oath. How do you get out of that oath? Death. Okay? Blood covenants are the most binding of covenants. What did you say? What did you say?
An unbreakable vow.
An unbreakable vow. The only way that you can break it was with your own life. Okay? Blood covenants are the most binding of oaths and covenants. Well, when we talk about Judaism and we talk about, to some extent, Christianity, the significant agreements and things that bind these religions are based on blood oaths and blood covenants. Today I'm going to talk about 3 of them. The first covenant I want to talk about is the covenant found in Genesis that's called the Abrahamic covenant, Abraham's covenant. Let's do a little backstory. Abraham did not know anything about Jehovah or God or any of that stuff, but at some point in his life, he was told to leave his father's house, leave his country, leave his family, and then go to a country that he was a stranger of. And so he uprooted everything and went, and eventually he found himself in the region of Canaan. And he left with this idea or the promise that he would become a great nation, God would bless him, and all this other good stuff. And so one of the keys to Abraham's leaving was the promise of being a great nation, because up until that point, he and his wife, Sarah, were unable to have any children. And so one of the main signs that this God that had influenced him to uproot and leave everything he knew, the sign that this covenant was going to take place was that eventually, somehow or another, Sarah would have a child. Well, years and years have gone by since this promise was made. Here he is in a strange country, in a strange land, and there's no indication at all that any of these promises that were made to him were ever going to take place, even after he'd done all of this traveling and uprooted everything. And so by the time we get to this part of Genesis, Genesis 15, 7 to 17, something interesting happens between God, Jehovah, and Abraham. There's a conversation that goes on, and it initiates a covenant that is entered into. Let's read it. It says, he also said to him, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to take possession of it. But Abram said, O sovereign Lord, how can I know that I will gain possession of it? It sounds like he's beginning to doubt this Jehovah. You keep making all these promises, but nothing's happening. Okay? So the Lord said to him, bring me a heifer, a goat, and a ram, each 3 years old, along with a dove and a young pigeon. Abram brought all these to him, cut them in two, and arranged the halves opposite each other. And the birds, however, he did not cut in half. The birds of prey came down on the carcasses, but Abram drove them away. Let me stop there. It's an interesting thing. The man asks a specific question. How do I know that I can count on you doing the stuff you said? You've been telling me this stuff for years. Nothing has changed. Nothing is different. And yet you keep making these promises. How do I know? Can you give me some assurance that you're not just talking to me and just saying things that's not going to happen? You follow what I'm saying? And so in answer to that question, he says, bring me these animals. Now, Abram does not have to be told and explained what these animals mean, because this was a very common ceremony that was in existence during that time. It's called cutting a covenant. And in the process of, for example, two families or two kings or two heads of households that wanted to make some kind of a pact and agreement together. This was a very common ceremony that they would go through to solidify any kind of negotiation or some kind of agreement they were trying to come up with. Let's say, for argument's sake, that you had one family that were great warriors, but they were horrible farmers. And then you had another clan over here that were great farmers, but they couldn't slap you hard enough to make you even think twice. You know, they weren't warriors. And so the two heads come together and say, look, if I provide you with produce and some of what I grow, would you be willing to enter an agreement with me that anybody attacks me, you will take care of that, if you follow what I'm saying? Nations still do that, where a nation might have resources that another nation wants, and in exchange for protection, they will provide resources and so on. And so they would sit down and hammer out all the agreements, all of the details, and so on. And when they finally come to an accommodation where everybody agrees on all the terms, then they would have this elaborate ceremony where they would cut a covenant. I'm going to borrow some of your book bags. Let me grab yours. Let me grab this one. And so let's do this. Let's put one here. And I'm going to put this one. I need 4 more. Let me get another bag. Thank you. Take these 2. All right. I need 1 more. I need 1 more. Nobody wants to give up their bag. I ain't giving you my bag. I don't know what you're going to do with it. Okay, this is good. This is good right here. All right. All right, let's imagine that these are the animals. Now, you cut them in half. The halves that are cut, you point them toward each other so that the blood would pool together and create a pathway of blood. Do you see that? Okay? And so after they have taken the time to discuss and come to agreement, the two heads of the families, come with me. No, I didn't bring my knife. Okay. After they finish all of the negotiations, they have this big ceremony in front of everybody. And as they walk through these pieces, this bloody pathway, they recite the terms of the agreement that they made together. Okay? They'd walk through the pieces and stuff, and then that would be the act of cutting the covenant. Okay? That's enough. You can go. Make sure you wipe your feet off, all that blood on your feet. All right? Okay. All right? Now let's read the rest of this and see what happens. Watch this. And so he brings these animals and cuts them in half. Let's start at verse 12. As the sun was setting, Abram fell into a deep sleep, and a thick and a dreadful darkness came over him. Let me make this point. I want you to get this. This process is not holy, or is not a religious ceremony. It was a common ceremony during the days of Abraham. Do you understand? All right? And so, but you'll see why this ceremony is adopted into Hebrew thought. As the sun was setting, Abram fell into a deep sleep, and a thick and a dreadful darkness came over him. And the Lord said to him, know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and they will be enslaved and mistreated 400 years, but I will punish the nation they serve as slaves, and afterward they will come out with great possessions. You, however, will go to your fathers in peace and be buried at a good old age. In the 4th generation, your descendants will come back here, for the sins of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure. When the sun had set and darkness had fallen, a smoking fire pot and a blazing torch appeared and passed between the pieces. That's the pieces of cut animals. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abraham and said, to your descendants I give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the Euphrates, the land of the Kenites, Kenizzites, Cadmonites, Hittites, Perizzites, Rephaites, Amorites, Canaanites, Girgashites, and Jebusites. And so, notice how this begins. He asks a question. How can I know that I will gain possession of it? He starts his statement by saying, know for certain That's the answer to the question. But this is the question I want to ask you. Who entered into covenant in this scenario? Because as I illustrated, as you and I walk through the pieces, we are entering into covenant. So look at the text here and see who entered into the covenant. God and who? Who? Well, who passed between the pieces?
A fire pot and a.
You sure? He says Abraham passed through, right? No. Where's Abraham? Yeah, well, where's Abraham when all this is going on? He's asleep. Abraham did not pass through the pieces. So who covenanted? See, the act of walking through those pieces is the act of entering into the covenant. By the way, what do you think that the two parties are saying when they walk through the pieces? Yes, they agree, but what else are they saying? There's something more significant because, yes.
That they both should hold up the agreement.
And what happens if they don't?
One of them dies.
What they're saying, you're correct. What they're saying is, if either of us break the terms that we are reciting as we walk through these pieces, if either of us violate any of the terms of this agreement, let what happened to these animals happen to me. That's a blood oath. That's a blood covenant. All right? Notice the whole process. Abram is asking for assurances that all of the stuff that he's been doing, all of these promises that have been told him for years and years and years. This is a significant amount of time from the time he left Ur to the time this thing takes place. And he's saying, I need to know. How do I know that you're not playing with me? How do I know that this is going to happen? I need some assurances. And so what is being done here is answer to that one question. How can I know that this is going to happen? And so who enters into covenant? That's the other question. We've already established that Abram is asleep. So he's not entering into covenant. Notice that it's called Abram's covenant, but Abram is not entering into the covenant. Who's covenanting?
God.
Why do you say God?
Because it said the Lord said to him.
Yeah, but it's about what passes the pieces, a blazing torch and a smoking fire pot. Later on, when Moses comes into contact with Jehovah, what does he see? Fire that's burning in a tree, a burning bush. So that we see representations of fire going through these pieces. So this is what actually happened in this moment. First, Abram just doesn't go to sleep because he ate too much pizza before, the stuff happened. Abram goes into a deep sleep. This is something supernatural. He's knocked out. It's like somebody said, sleep. And he goes to sleep. And then this fire pot, and I say that God enters into, this is what I say, God enters into a covenant with himself on Abraham's behalf. Why would God not allow Abraham to go through that? Because clearly Abraham was not allowed to pass through those pieces. Because if Abraham had done something wrong or broke any of the terms of the covenant, what would have happened?
He would have to be cut in half.
Off with his head. Okay? All right? So this covenant says, and now let's look at the terms of the covenant. Number one, he says that he predicts these things are going to happen, but he also says that I'm going to give you a certain territory for, and this is an important word, at least to me, your descendants. What does descendants mean? Yes. Anybody that's born, that's part of your family. What are you going to say? His children. How many of his children? When the word is descendants, plural, how many children does you think that involves? So if I have 5 boys, how many of those boys will be connected to this covenant? Okay, we'll see. Let's take a look at the territory. All right. It says it talks about two rivers. It says from the river of Egypt to the great river, the Euphrates. We can figure out what that is. Take a look at the map. Here is the Nile. Here's the Euphrates. That's huge. You see that? This is the territory that's being referred to in that covenant. Now, the reason why this is important for me to get into this, you do recognize that that moment in history, that few words in the book of Genesis, is the basis for most of the conflict we're engaged in worldwide right now. This right here, this piece of real estate. And it's based on that moment where the man says, how do I know? And all of this territory, it's clearly marked out on the west and on the east by those two rivers. Do you see that? Okay? Now, my big problem with all of this discussion and fighting is that one word, to your descendants. Because originally, if you know the story of Abraham, how many know a little bit about the story of Abraham? A little bit. You know that even after this moment in Genesis, he still didn't have any children with his wife for a long time. You know that, right? What happened? He slept with a maid. Did he just do that on his own?
No, his wife and him agreed.
Yeah, no, his wife. You know, listen, think for a minute. Now, when this promise first is introduced to Abraham, how old was he? Anybody know? He was 75 years old, which is pretty advanced at that time. I mean, from our perspective. And his wife, who was 10 years younger, was about 65. Okay? And so you can imagine. Now, let me say this. For her age, according to the stories we have in Genesis, Sarah was pretty stunning. Good looking woman. She probably one of them Halle Berry types that look good forever. You understand what I'm saying? Just hot all the way till the day she died. You understand? One of them Halle Berry looking females. And so, you know, because Abraham was scared everywhere he went that somebody gonna knock him over the head and take his wife from him. And so you can imagine that when he gets this revelation and God speaks to him, you're gonna have a great nation and great multitudes of descendants. You know what he did, right? Immediately following hearing that, I mean, when he was 75, you know what he did, right? Come on now, y'all know what he did. No, he didn't. He went to Victoria's Secret and got him a couple of things. And Mama, put this on tonight. You know. Oh yeah. And I would imagine that she was very happy to be right there along with him until year one, year two goes by, and she probably pulled him aside. Look at here, old man, slow down, because I don't know what you ate that day, because I don't know if you just dreamt that or something. And so eventually, some long years after this promise is made, she's the one that comes up with the suggestion that maybe, because in those days, if you have a slave girl, anything that comes from her is yours too. She tells her husband, after the covenant was made, to your descendants, to anything that passes from your body, to your descendants, all of this land is going to be given to them. And so his wife tells him, look, here's my young maid, you know, and I'm going to allow you to go ahead and do what you need to do with your maid, and whatever passes through her is mine anyway. So go ahead and do your thing with her. And I can imagine that Abram said, honey, as much as this pains me to do this, I'll I'll just go ahead and do it just for your sake, darling. So he just goes ahead and does it. And immediately she has a child. And that child's name is what? Ishmael. Write his name down. Ishmael. Okay? Ishmael. Ish. Ishmael. Mael. Any word that ends with the el, that El stands for Elohim, God. So if you notice, a lot of Jewish names end with El. Samuel, Ishmael, okay? And so Bethel, house of God, okay? See, so here this man engages with this slave girl. He has a child. Question: does the covenant that was made earlier on include this child? Yes. We find out it does, because the descendants of Ishmael, guess where they settled?
And,
Saudi Arabia, right in here, within those two boundaries. You understand? See, so the problem with the argument that and there are some specific things in the covenant that talk about going into slavery and stuff like that, and all of that takes place. But by adding more children to his descendants, it complicated that covenant. Do you see that? Okay? You don't get this kind of detail when people get into these arguments. But at the college level, we don't play that. You've got to, let's go look at the original information here. Wait a minute. Okay, and let me finish out Abram, because after Sarah died in Genesis chapter 25. Oh, she did. Sometime later she had a kid, and his name was Isaac. From Abraham. But she didn't have that child until she was 100 years old. 25 years later. 100 years old. Look at her face like. And let me help you. And this dude, he was 100, she was 90. She was 90. That's a little better, I guess, because she was 90. Okay. But she had, and when Isaac was born, you can imagine the rivalry that developed in that household. Now she has her own child. And so this other child is really now a rival, having been born 13 years earlier. So he's 13 when her son is born. Okay? And so eventually she gets to the point where she says, you know what? I don't want this girl around me. I don't want this boy around me. I don't want him getting nothing. And so they got chained, or got thrown out, and ended up living in Arabia. But this is the interesting part. When Abraham was 137 years old, Sarah was 127, she dies. She passes away. She dies. And after the mourning period in Genesis chapter 25, Abraham, at 135 years of age, takes another wife. And they did not have them little blue pills either. Okay? He takes another wife whose name was Keturah, and she had kids. Zimran, Jokshan, Midian. You ever heard of Midianites? That's where they come from. Ishbak and Shua. You know, it's like somebody sneezed when he was born. What's his name? Shua! He sneezed. Jokshan was the father of Sheba and Dedan. Now, I don't know, but the queen of Sheba could have come from here. Say again? No, they don't. They don't, because they're more Arab than they are Hebrew. All right? The descendants of Dedan were the Asherites, and all of these, the sons of Midian were, and so on and so forth. And so look at this. So all of these are his descendants. And when you look at where they settled, they settle in this region. They all settle in that area. Okay? All of that area. Okay? This is the source of conflict that continues to be an issue thousands of years later. Do you see that? And it all goes back to this moment where he asks a question. How will I know that I can count on what you're saying? How do I know that I'm going to get what you say I'm going to get? I'm going to give you this land. How do I know? It was on the basis of a covenant, and the covenant was not between God and man, God and himself on his behalf, which means that he can't break what he said. Do you follow what I'm saying? It's not just a handshake agreement that you can giggle and cross your fingers behind your back and then don't do what you're supposed to do. No, this is one of those things that if you don't do it, there's a price to pay for not entering into that. And so this is the basis whereby a covenant was entered into with Abraham. Now, when it comes to Jews, Jews believe that none of the provisions of this covenant falls to anybody but them. Are you following me? I don't see how it cannot be for others as well that came through Abraham. In fact, when you read the story of Ishmael and when he is thrown out of the household of Abraham, God makes specific promises to Hagar and through her to her son that he's going to be also a great nation. And it's not because of Hagar and it's not because of Ishmael, it's because of the promise that was given to Abraham. I believe it was never God's intent to do this, but once he entered into that covenant, when Abraham started making these additional family lines, they had to fit into that covenant as well.
Is that why he was punished though? Because they were punished?
Who were punished?
I think the Bible punished the nation they served as slaves and afterwards.
Yeah, but the nation they served as slaves were the Egyptians. They weren't part of his family. Okay, good. That's a good question. They weren't, it wasn't, these people here are not connected to him. Do you follow me? All right, let's move on. Now I want to talk about the second blood covenant, the Sinai covenant. Abraham is dead. His family has grown to the point where they number a significant number, but during the time of Jacob, his grandson, the clan that was all his moved from Canaan to Egypt. The story about Joseph and his becoming the prime minister of Egypt and stuff, you can read that on your own. And eventually they grow to a large, huge number of folk over the 400 years that was predicted they would be in a land that was not their own. And so finally someone is raised up named Moses, who finally is now leading them to leave Egypt and to be delivered from the slavery that they now find themselves in. After having left Egypt and defeating the army in the Red Sea and all of that story, if you know anything about those biblical stories, you can go back and look at those in Exodus. In the wilderness, they reach this place where they are told to sit and listen as Jehovah tells them the terms of his agreement, not with Abraham, but he creates a new covenant just for these people that have just left Egypt. And he's now putting together a covenant with them. And so after reciting what is known as the Ten Commandments and some other things, he says, I'm the Lord your God that took you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage, and blah, blah, blah. You can take a time and read that from Exodus 19 and on. After he tells them what he wants them to do and gives them the terms of the agreement, then he does this. He says, when Moses went and told the people all the Lord's words and laws, this is found in Exodus chapter 24, verses 3-8, they responded with one voice. Everything the Lord has said, we will do. Moses wrote down everything the Lord had said. He got up early the next morning and built an altar at the foot of the mountain and set up 12 stone pillars representing the 12 tribes of Israel. Then he sent young Israelite men, and they offered burnt offerings and sacrificed young bulls as fellowship offerings to the Lord. Moses took half the blood and put it in bowls. The other half he sprinkled on the altar. Then he took the book of the covenant and read it to the people. Now, a second time, they responded, we will do everything the Lord has said. We will obey. Moses then took the blood, sprinkled it on the people, and said, this is the blood of the covenant that the Lord has made with you in accordance with all these laws, all these words, And so, here's another blood oath, another blood covenant. Who's entering into covenant in this scenario, based on what we've learned so far about covenants? And, well, Moses is not entering into a covenant. Moses is the mediator. He's the one who's the go-between between the two parties. You see that? And so he's reading, he goes up and gets the terms. He comes down and recites the terms and says, are you willing to abide by these terms? They say yes, twice. But the second time, what does he do? And what is that? What is the act of engaging or touching or getting involved with the blood? What does that actually do? It binds you. What is that term you said again? I have to write that down.
Unbreakable vow.
Unbreakable vow, yeah. Once that blood is engaged in this scenario, it makes it a blood oath. It makes it an unbreakable vow. And should you break that vow, what are the consequences? Death. Yes. And so, this is an example of a second blood covenant. And that blood covenant was the covenant that established the nation of Israel. The covenant with Abraham is not the covenant that the Israelites entered into. This is their covenant that involves the 10 commandments and so on. Yes.
But aren't the Israelites descendants of Abraham?
And so are Ishmael and all of those others. And they benefit from Abraham's covenant. You see the distinction?
Yeah. So the Israelites, what's the difference between the Israelites in this covenant? Is it because this is particular to them and them only?
Yes, this is them. This is their covenant. The Israelites, that's a good question. The Israelites are the descendants of Isaac, Jacob, and that line of Abraham's family, specifically that group. Okay? Do you follow that? Okay? So I make a distinction, and maybe others may find this a little bit too, but I think it's correct, that Abraham's covenant is this broad. The Sinai covenant is very narrow. Do you follow that? Okay. That's how I make the distinction. This is God's covenant with these people who came out of Egypt, and they met him at the Sinai, in the Sinai desert, and he set up a covenant specifically with them. Those laws, those commandments, all those things, the temple, because as you listen to the film, some very important things are said there, where the Israelites are very temple oriented. We talk about the tabernacle in the wilderness where the presence of God was, at least as they describe it. And then later on, when we get to David and Solomon, they built a temple in Jerusalem. It's a big deal. But the establishment of the temple, the establishment of the laws, the Ark of the Covenant, who mentioned the Ark of the Covenant? The Ark of the Covenant housed the handwritten terms of the agreement, and it's on tablets of stone, and inside this chest that's covered with gold holds the terms of the covenant that they agreed to in this moment right here. You follow me? So that's what makes the ark so essential, because the covenant agreement between God and these people were housed in that chest. Yes, sir.
You said that the terms were the Ten Commandments?
Exactly. They were the 10 Commandments, specifically those 10 Commandments. Don't do this, don't do that, don't do the other, so on and so forth. Yes.
But isn't there something more special about the Ark of the Covenant itself?
You mean like in Raiders of the Lost Ark and stuff?
When Joshua goes to Jericho to make the walls fall, he's asked to bring the Ark, he's asked to move the Ark around the walls of Jericho 4
Yeah.
times and then blow the horn.
Yeah. The chest itself, my personal view, the chest is not as important as doing what you were told to do. The obedience to the command to carry it around is more important than the chest itself. In other words, I don't think, like in Raiders of the Lost Ark, the chest itself has some magical powers. I don't think that. I think that the act of doing what you were told to do is more important than the box itself. Does that make sense? Yeah. That's just my view. I could be wrong. All right? And so this is the second covenant. It's called the Old Covenant or the Sinai Covenant. Now, if you know your Bible stories, what happened not too long after this? Moses goes up into the mountain to confer further with God, and I think he's talking about more rules and more stuff about the specifics of the building of the tabernacle and all that kind of stuff. He goes up there and he stays up there for a long, long time. In fact, the mountain was covered with this huge cloud of fire and thunder and stuff. And it got to the point where the people said, listen, we like the fact that God got us out of Egypt, but he's kind of loud and scary. And would you go talk to him and then come back and tell us what he says? Because the way he be talking is scary to us. And so Moses would go up and engage God in conversation and then bring back what he said to the people. Well, this one time he went up there for 40 days. I can imagine a couple of days or a week later, and they go on knocking on the tent and ask Mrs. Moses, your husband back yet? I hope he didn't go up there and say the wrong thing, because he might not have come back. And anybody know the story about while he was gone, what happened? They fell back into idolatry and so on. But please note, they fell back into idolatry after they made a blood oath. So what happens when Moses comes back? He told the folk, he said, first he throws the tablets down where God had wrote down what he told him to do. And then he's symbolizing basically that they broke the covenant. And then he says, separate yourselves from these people. And eventually what happened is that day, all those people that broke the oath, they died that day. Go back and read it. You'll see it. Okay? And so the act of taking this oath and this covenant is significant. It's very significant. And what happens here is that we see that when they took the blood oath and then they violated the oath, they violated it to the extent that they lost their lives. The penalty was death. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. There were situations where people had done stuff and the people were told back off away from that brother, and the ground would just open up, swallow up the people and then close back up on top of them. It's kind of pretty horrific. Okay? But a blood oath is a serious thing. The Sinai covenant was a covenant that established the nation of Israel. It established their worship. It established their temple. It established the parameters of the relationship between Yahweh and them. Those were the written terms. And that's what makes, when you hear a Jew talk about the Torah, please note what the Torah is. Do you know what the Torah, T-O-R-A-H, write that down. T-O-R-A-H. It's basically the first 5 books of the Old Testament written by Moses. And it walks them through the history of the creation of Israel. From Adam to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob, to Joseph, to Moses, all the way to Joshua and Caleb and entering into the promised land. It tells that one story that begins with a promise to Abraham and ends with the fulfillment of the promise 400 and some odd years later, where they finally enter into Canaan on the basis of the promise that was made to the covenant that was made to Abraham earlier. But please note, as I see it, that not only was the Israelites allowed to live in that land, but the Midianites and others in that region were also allowed to live in there. And I believe they are allowed to live in there because they were also descendants of Abraham. Are there any questions so far? I think you've reached a saturation point. I'm getting this look like, okay, I don't think I can take another few minutes of this. Yes?
Well, my question is why are Jews so bent on a home? You understand what I'm saying?
Yep.
Why do they care so much about a home and just don't live within, like you said,
In a pluralistic environment.
all of the turmoil that's happening right now is because of the biblical sense of all those lands.
Well, let me answer your question. That's a very excellent question. The answer is this. It has to do with how you interpret the covenant. And if you interpret the covenant as being for me and me alone and nobody else, then you can take that position. Do you follow me? I can't see how you can do that when you read the rest of the story. Okay? And I'm going to show, I wish I had time. Let's do that. Let's do that now, since you raise it. Can you give me 10 minutes and I'll let you go home? Because it's been a long day. All right? Because we're going to go through I wanted to go through the history of Judaism. I'll do that after they enter into Canaan. I'll do that next class. But I want to show you, I'm going to answer your question this way. Okay? Well, let me do a 5-minute history, because the only way I can do this is if I talk about the history. Okay, please pay attention to this. This is very important to answer his question. Let's do real fast history. Israel finally gets into Canaan when Joshua gets them into Canaan. Okay? They establish a kingdom. For a while, they have what are known as judges. You ever heard of Samson and Delilah? He was one of the judges. You ever heard of Gideon and the 300 that goes in? And he's also a judge. A judge was somebody through whom God ruled the people. Okay? He wasn't called a king. He called them judges. I don't know why they called them that. All right? And so for a period of time, they had those. But then eventually they said, you know what? We want to have a king. And so God wasn't in favor of it, but he said, give the people what they want. Let them have a king. So the first king, you might want to write this down. The first king that they ever had was a guy named Saul, S-A-U-L. Say again? First king that they had after the judges, of the period of the judges, the first king, his name was Saul, S-A-U-L. Now, he reigned for a significant amount of time, but for only 2 years of his reign was he really in God's favor. He had a real problem doing what he was supposed to do, and I'll explain kingdom when we get into Christianity, okay? And so within 2 years of his reign, God had really got tired of Saul, and then he sent a prophet, the prophet Samuel, to find and anoint someone else who would be a king that would do like he was told. And it was in that context that this young little boy named David was anointed. He was anointed to be king, even though there was another king on the throne. All right? And so for a significant period of time, for a while, he allowed David to be in his court. And then finally, when he realized that David had the anointing on him, he tried to kill him, and David had to run for his life. And for a significant amount of time, David was in exile. But after Saul died, David became the second king of Israel. David was a warrior, successful in everything he did. And he also brought the Ark of the Covenant and decided that he wanted to create and build a temple. But God said, no, you can't build it because you've killed too many people, but I will allow your son to do it. His son, whose name was Solomon, that's the third king of Israel, was able to build. The biggest thing he did in his life was to build the temple in Jerusalem. Okay? After Solomon, there was a rebellion from 10 of the tribes. They split off and became the northern kingdom called Israel. The southern kingdom became the kingdom of Judah. And after that point, you had two kingdoms that represented the 12 tribes of Israel. And they had periods of obedience and disobedience, periods of obedience. And every time they disobeyed, God would pull back his protection. Outside forces would invade and create havoc and problems and so on. And this period lasted for a significant amount of time until finally Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, first overran and took over the northern kingdom, and then eventually he took over the southern kingdom, the kingdom of Judah. Now, what makes this important is when he took over the kingdom of Judah, he destroyed the temple. The Ark of the Covenant was disappeared at that point and has never been seen since. And even though they had hundreds of years where they had their own king and their own land, they were pushed out of their land. And from that point on, they were subject to occupying powers from Babylon to Medo-Persia to the Greeks to the Romans. You remember we went through those four kingdoms earlier on. Now, this is the point. The point is that when Nebuchadnezzar attacked and successfully destroyed the kingdom of Israel, both the northern and southern kingdom, the desire for Jews was to one day be restored to the glory that they experienced during the days of David and Solomon, where God protected them, God helped them build their kingdom, they had their temple, they had all those wonderful things. Okay? And so the desire, and there were promises in the Bible, in the Old Testament prophets, that promised that one day they would be allowed to go back to Jerusalem, and that there would be a Messiah that would come, that would bring them back to God and bring them back to where they're supposed to be. And they interpreted that as this Messiah would bring Israel back to the glory that it had during the days of David. That's what they wanted more than anything else. All right? Now, that short history that I've given you will explain what I'm going to show you now. All right, let's go here. This is a website let me go to the first page. These are Jews. This is a website called True Torah Jews, and they have there's a thing called Zionism that I need to talk about, and this answers your point. Let's go back to... Let me explain what Zionism is. How did we make this bigger? I forgot. Is it here? Okay, can y'all see that? Zionism is a movement founded by Theodor Herzl in 1896, whose goal was the return of the Jews to Eretz Yisrael, or Zion, the Jewish synonym for Jerusalem in the land of Israel. The name Zionism comes from the hill Zion, the hill on which the Temple of Jerusalem was situated. Supporters of this movement are called Zionists. Today, there's much confusion among Jews over the meaning of the term Zionism. It means different things to different people. The reason for this is that historically, Zionism has been a movement dominated by secularist Jews. Herzl and most of his colleagues were assimilated Jews who do not believe in or practice the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible. When I use that word Torah, the books of Moses. Some Zionists were vehemently anti-religious and saw the Torah and the mitzvahs as outdated rituals with no place in the modern state. Yet the essence of the Zionist idea that Jews should return to the Holy Land and establish a government is not inherently secular, and in fact, the Zionist movement has had some religious members from the very beginning. Some Jews today use Zionism as a synonym for Israeli secularism, and thus support the state of Israel while claiming to be anti-Zionist. These people's only complaint about the state of Israel is that it is not religious enough. They hope for the day when the state will be dominated by religious parties. Okay, now let me show you what they say about Zionism. Let me go back to Our Mission. I want you to hear this, and I'll explain what they mean in just a moment. The relatively new concept of Zionism began only about 100 years ago. Since that time, Torah True Jewry has steadfastly opposed Zionist ideology. This struggle is rooted in 2 convictions. And there's some words here that I'm going to explain in a minute. Zionism, by advocating a political and military end to the Jewish exile, when it says Jewish exile, it means that they're saying that God used Nebuchadnezzar to push them out of their land because of their disobedience. That's what these Jews are saying. And so they were exiled from Israel, or the land that they were living in, from the days of Saul and David all the way to the last kings of Judah and Israel. They were pushed out because God, the prophets said that y'all weren't listening and y'all didn't do like I told you to do. All right. And he says, by advocating a political and military end to the Jewish exile, denies the very essence of our diaspora. Diaspora is another word for exile. Existence, or being spread out into all the world. All right. We are in exile by divine decree and may emerge from exile solely via divine redemption. That's another way of saying they're looking for the Messiah to end their exile. All human efforts to alter a metaphysical reality are doomed to end in failure and bloodshed. History has clearly borne out this teaching. When he says divine redemption, they look for the Messiah. That's what the prophet said would happen, according to their belief system, would come back and by miraculous means reestablish this kingdom that was lost because of disobedience. The same way that God set up the first kingdom under David and all those guys. All right? Number 2, Zionism has not only denied our fundamental belief in heavenly redemption, it has also created a pseudo-Judaism which views the essence of our identity to be a secular nationalism. Accordingly, Zionism and the Israeli state have consistently endeavored via persuasion and coercion to replace a divine, Torah-centered understanding of our peoplehood with an armed materialism. This is what's going on. There are those that says, we're not waiting for the Messiah, we're taking it ourselves. That's what's going on, and that's what they're saying is going on. True Torah Jews is dedicated to informing the world, and in particular the American public and politicians, that not all Jews support the ideology of the Zionist state called Israel. In fact, a great number of Orthodox Jews give the ideology of that state as diametrically opposed to the teachings of traditional Judaism. I don't have time to read all of that. And so the point is this. In answer to your question, Since Israel had been pushed out of the land of Israel from way back from the days of Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonian Empire and the Persian Empire and the Greek Empire and the Roman Empire, all those empires at one time or another occupied the Palestine region. They've always wanted God to send somebody, and there were promises of a Messiah that would come. And they interpreted that as that God was going to send a Messiah to push these occupying powers out of their land and restore Israel to a kingdom the same way it was under David. Okay? And so that's what they're looking for. Zionism, on the other hand, while saying that this is our land and stuff, these guys are saying, you guys are doing it on your own. You're using politics, you're using power, military might, whatever you can come up with, intrigue, coercion, whatever, you're doing it. And we oppose you because the only way it's supposed to happen, according to their view of the Torah, is that some kind of divine redemption is supposed to take place. And so there's this argument that's going on within Judaism about what should be done or how this is supposed to be restored. I don't have time to get into it. But the point I'm raising is this. This is the last thing I'm going to say. I'm going to let y'all go. What many of you don't realize, how many young men here are 18 or coming right around 18? Some of you guys, it's good you're in college. I don't think we have a draft anymore, but there's a lot of young men that are going overseas and fighting battles and wars that are all related to this situation right here. They may come up with this excuse or that excuse, but it all boils down to this argument over that piece of real estate. All right? One of the things I wanted to do, in addition to teaching you about the history of all this stuff and the religion and all that, and the culture, I also wanted you to be aware of the real issues that relate to, and even though we're talking about 2,500, maybe four or 5,000 years ago, it's still having an impact today. And I wanted to make sure you're aware of it, at least expose you to some aspects of it that you may not have been aware of. Okay? And so the arguments about Palestine, Israel, Syria, the Golan Heights, Gaza Strip, all of that stuff is all, you go look back at that map I showed you, all of that territory is within that framework, all of that. And what you may not realize is that the foreign policies of the French, the Brits, the United States, the Australians, the Germans, all of their foreign policy, all of them are lined up with the idea that these people should have this land, and they have made the decision to support with money and military power and ideology that is rooted in Genesis chapter 25. I just wanted you to be aware of that. I don't care what anybody says, it goes back to that moment. Are there any questions?